It's September 2021, and thousands of people line the streets of Wichita, Kansas. A horse-drawn caisson slowly makes its way down the street, pulling behind it a casket draped with an American flag. The people bow their heads as the casket moves by. Some tear up, some wave flags and solemnly nod their heads, and some salute the fallen Medal of Honor recipient being buried today. The horses stop in front of a small church. Soldiers slowly lift the casket from the caisson and stand in place, while other soldiers perform a 21-gun salute. The assembled crowd, which includes relatives and those who fought beside the fallen hero, stand there, moved. They watch as the casket is slowly carried into the church, his final resting spot. It is a stirring ceremony, one of thousands that are performed across the country every year. But this funeral is different and very rare. Why? The hero being laid to rest today died in 1951, over 70 years ago. Father Emil Kapaun took part in both World War II and in the Korean War, saving the lives of countless men and receiving a posthumous Medal of Honor for those feats. Unfortunately, he died while imprisoned in a POW camp, and his remains were lost. His family, friends, and fellow soldiers were never able to say a proper farewell to the man they called Padre. Until the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA, were able to find his remains.
A priest from a small town out on those Kansas plains. To the soldiers who walked beside him, they would never forget his name.
The organization, a part of the Department of Defense, consists of researchers, field workers, and anthropologists who spend every minute working to locate and identify the remains of American soldiers lost overseas. The work they do is so impressive and so immense that we're devoting our next 2 episodes to the DPAA. We sit down with 4 individuals, a relative of Father Kapaun, 2 researchers who helped to bring him home, and another researcher who similarly helped to bring home Lieutenant Fred Brewer of the fabled Tuskegee Airmen. They've each played unique roles, but at their core, they all have one simple mission.
Someday we'll be home at last. Smell supper cooking on the stove.
No matter what, if something happens to you, even 80 years later, we will continue to look for you. It is something we do here.
I think that we owe our society today, the way that we are able to live our lives, to these people who sacrificed everything for their country. And I think that making sure that we honor them and we don't forget them is part of our responsibility as Americans.
It'll leave you speechless. It'll have you crying for what they're doing to try to bring some closure to families, and painstaking efforts they do is just incredible.
He was teary, and I was teary that the identification took place because so many people went into making that happen.
Boys, I'm finally going home at last.
I'm Carrie Virohaikis, and this is Army Matters. Our hosts first sat down with Ray Kapaun, who talked to them about the heroism of his uncle, Father Emil Kapaun,
and how Ray and his family had given up all hope that the POW's remains would ever be found.
First off, Ray, please introduce yourself.
My name is Raymond Emil Kapaun. I'm from Whidbey Island, Washington. Father Emil Kapaun is my uncle.
Ray, we're so happy that you're on the show. So Father Kapaun was a war hero. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Well, he was a homegrown country boy. I mean, they grew up outside of Pilsen, Kansas, a typical Western town that's got a huge Catholic church with about 10 homes, doesn't even have a post office. And they grew up out there with my dad. It was just him and my dad. And Father, from the very beginning, knew what he wanted to be. I mean, my grandmother always said he always knew he wanted to be a priest. And as luck would have it, he became the hometown priest for the Pilsen parish. And he was all about helping people. I mean, all the time. I mean, that was his mission in life, was to help others. He would sacrifice anything and everything, even growing up, to help others.
Can you tell us what drove Father to enlist and serve during not one, but two different wars?
I have no doubt in my mind that's where he was always meant to be. You know, I've still got a lot of his personal letters that he wrote to my parents and grandparents. And you could just tell by reading that of how happy wouldn't be the right word, but that knowing that that is where he was supposed to be, that on the ground, you know, getting grubby and dirty and never sleeping and bullets flying over your head and bombs bursting beside you. I'll tell you a story. Father went in at the end of World War II. He was in Burma and then came back from that, was a parish priest for a while back in Pilsen again. And then the Korean War started up. Well, he was originally going to Japan. And he was in Washington, D.C. at the time going to school, and he was going to drive back because he was going to sail out of Seattle to go to Japan and then to Korea. And he drove back and went through Kansas and stopped and saw his parents and my dad. And he pulled my dad aside and he said, don't tell mom and dad. He said, I don't think I'm coming back from this one. And dad was shocked. He's like, well, what do you mean? Don't talk like that. He goes, no, I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad or that I feel bad. He goes, I don't think I'm coming back from this one. He said, I just wanted to let you know.
Wow. I mean, and then he still wanted to go. And while there, he exhibited incredible bravery throughout the war. Can you tell us about his actions that eventually led to him earning the Congressional Medal of Honor?
I mean, nothing ever stopped him. I mean, there'd be bombs flying overhead and bullets flying everywhere. It was nothing for him to be running out onto the battlefield, jumping out of all the foxholes to drag a wounded fellow back. He was awarded the Medal of Honor because of what he did for Herb Miller. And Herb Miller ended up being a soldier who was in the group with Father. And Herb's ankle had gotten shot and he couldn't walk. And he was actually had pulled a dead soldier on top of him, just trying to cover up, because everybody knew at that time that the North Koreans weren't taking prisoners. If you were wounded whatsoever, there was, you were going to be killed. There was no prisoners taken. At that point, they had already been captured, and Father was being held, and they found Herb was still alive, and one of the South Korean soldiers had pointed a gun to Herb's head, and Father pushed away the guard that was holding him and walked over to where Herb was at and pulled him away. And that was his bravery. He never thought about himself. It was always everyone else.
I've sat on the Medal of Honor board. You have to prove without a doubt, it's not the benefit of the doubt, without a doubt that the bravery occurred. And there must be witnesses, right? So it's not something that is easy to prove. And I also want to point out for our listeners, when we say the word non-combatant, we don't want to get lost in translation there for our non-military listeners. But for a chaplain, that means he or she does not carry a weapon on the battlefield, right? So this is a person that's there to help the soldiers achieve their mission by giving them spiritual faith. They're in combat, but they're not allowed to carry a weapon, which is incredible. So he's running around the battlefield with all the bullets flying with no weapon. So, but talk about some of the stuff he did in the POW camp beyond what was cited in his Medal of Honor. Ray, can you do that for us?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the POWs always all called him the good thief. After they had been captured, they were marched about 60 miles, stopping at several places along the way that would get bombed out and they'd have to move again. But it was about a 60-mile walk altogether. And it ended up being the coldest winter that Korea had ever seen. They were definitely being starved to death. All they got was basically, they call it mullet, but basically it's just bird seed. And everybody was freezing to death. When they'd sleep at night, they'd all be in one room and they'd all sleep like firewood stacked up with each other. The only way they could stay warm. And Father, he would actually sneak out of the camp to find some kind of food, just bring some flour back or just something that they had something a little bit better to eat than what they were given in the camp.
Yeah.
He would sneak out of his camp and go into the other camps to say rosary with the guys and say prayers with the guys and kind of help cheer them up.
Yeah. And from what I've read, it seemed like even though he was a prisoner of war, he was revered by his comrades, but feared by the guards. Is that correct?
The men loved him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they would have followed him off the end of the earth. They knew that he was the one that kept them alive. I mean, when you look at the records, his camp had the highest survival rate of any of the other camps, and they all attributed it to him for lifting their spirits up. He always made it a better day for them.
Wow. And then, unfortunately, Father Emil Kapaun succumbed to his wounds and exposure of the prison camp, and he died. Can you tell us about that, Ray?
Yeah, he had gotten injured and had blood clot in his leg. And then he had ended up getting pneumonia during that time. And the guys started taking care of him, started helping him, which Father kept refusing because, like I said, he was all about helping others and didn't really want assistance. But it was to the point where they knew he wasn't going to survive unless they did anything. And they had what the North Koreans called the hospital, but it really all it was a death house. I mean, anybody who went there never came out.
Yeah.
And they saw their chance with Father being sick and not doing well, that they came in and said, well, we're going to take him to the hospital. And all the POWs started pushing back and we're going to fight. And Father's like, no, you're not, you need to let me go. Nobody else needs to die because of me. And, they ended up taking him away to the hospital where he didn't last very long, but passed away while he was in the hospital.
So, Ray, I know this was really difficult, but how did Father Kapaun's death affect his family back home?
My grandmother never gave up hope that they were going to find Father. You know, she wouldn't believe for a long time that Father had died. Of course, for quite a few years, word really hadn't even gotten out that he had died. It was just he was a POW, and that's as far as it went. And then when they got confirmation that he had died in the camp, she just wouldn't believe it. And then she was going to go over, and once they finally convinced her, yes, he's not alive, then she wanted to go to North Korea and bring him back home. And the local priest is like, no, you can't do that. So it was all those years of his mother never giving up hope that basically brought him back home.
Do you have a lesson or insight to share? Would you like to strengthen the soldier profession? The Harding Project, a grassroots effort, provides resources to help you develop and write articles in Army journals that can help influence the next generation of soldiers. For more information, go to hardingproject.com. Have you purchased your AUSA swag yet? Be proud to show your support for AUSA, which in turn shows your support for the U.S. Army and our soldiers. Check out all AUSA swag at shop.ausa.org.
Our host sat down with Josh Frank, a researcher at DPAA. Josh detailed some of the work he does and how he was able to locate the remains of Lieutenant Fred Brewer, a member of the fabled Tuskegee Airmen.
Josh, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do at DPAA.
My name is Joshua Frank. I grew up just outside of Athens, Georgia, and now I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I am a research analyst with the Defense POW MIA accounting agency.
Josh, welcome to the show, brother.
Thanks for having me.
So Josh, we were talking about this before we started recording. You know a number of languages, and that's helped you at DPAA. So can you say hello to our listeners in a couple other languages?
So in Korean, I could just say 안녕하십니까 to the two of you. That's a nice hello. Honorific, since I'm with a former sergeant major of the Army and a general here. And in Vietnamese, you could say ciao or xin ciao.
Xin ciao. Okay. Nice. Good.
Now, before you served with the DPAA, you were actually in the Army. What did you do, and how did you transition from that to the DPAA?
I was a signals intelligence analyst.
Okay.
With a language identifier. So joined the Army right out of high school in 98, went to Monterey to the Defense Language Institute for Korean for about a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Went to AIT in Texas, and then I went straight to Korea and stayed in Korea for a long time. Left Korea, came back to DC to Fort Belvoir, working for the Intelligence Security Command.
Okay.
Was about to get out of the Army.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every soldier has a story about a sergeant major who did not want them to get out of the Army. I had a really good sergeant major. Maureen Johnson was the command sergeant major of the Intelligence Security Command. She came to me and said, "Hey, they're looking for somebody who can take Vietnamese and graduate on the first try to go to the Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, our predecessor agency, to go there to look for missing people in Vietnam. I thought about you. Do you want to do it?" When I was at AIT, I had a platoon sergeant and had worked for the very first version of DPAA, the Joint Task Force Full Accounting. I remember being a really young soldier and thinking, that's a really cool job. How do you get that? And then 8 years later, it's staring me in the face. I've got an opportunity to go do it. So I jumped on it, re-enlisted. And once you get the first ID, just to be even the smallest part of it, you don't even have to be the one that goes out. The mission just grabs you. And I realized right away that I didn't want to do anything else. So even though I was over halfway to retirement, but I found what I felt like was my calling. So I got out and became a civilian.
All right. So what's an average day look like at DPAA for you?
So it all begins with historical and archival work, trying to find information about the men who are missing. So we have our list of around 83,000 men who are missing from World War II to today.
Now say that number again, 83,000?
Around 83,000 missing.
Wow.
Yes, sir.
Dan, did you know that?
I didn't know it was that high. Wow. Yeah.
So our office is in DC, at least for the Europe section. Our office is in DC. So we're able to just go to the National Archives or to the Library of Congress, or Carlisle Barracks up there has an Army archive. Try to get our hands on all of the World War II era military records we can get our hands on that might give us some clues. So we're talking missing aircrew reports for Army Air Force's losses. We're talking after action reports and operational reports, G3 journals from wartime, day by day map overlays, the original maps. We're trying to get our hands on everything that we can to put all the information together about where a missing man might be that we can go look.
Okay.
That's step one. And then we've used that to build these large swaths of geospatial databases where we can look at maps and have a map of where we think, for example, where our best idea of where all the planes during World War II crashed.
Okay.
And then compare that to information that we've gotten from other sources.
Okay.
So you get to that point, you have an idea of maybe where you want to look. Is the person maybe buried as an unknown? Is it a crash site we want to go look for? Is there a battlefield we might want to go do some work on? And then planning mission. So this morning I was planning a mission to Croatia. So what does an investigation mission look like? And all the planning that goes into it versus then going to the field. So it's never boring. It changes a lot day by day.
Now, Josh, in this episode, we're talking about two service members that your organization helped to bring home. We've already talked about Father Emil Kapaun, and we want your story about the role you played in finding Lieutenant Fred Brewer. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Second Lieutenant Fred Brewer was a pilot during World War II. He's from Charlotte, North Carolina. Before he was in the Army, got a chemistry degree from Shaw University. Then he joined the military and became a pilot with the 100th Fighter Squadron in the 332nd Fighter Group, which, if you know your history, those were the famous Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. So Fred Brewer was a Red Tail.
And do you know about any of his accomplishments during World War II?
I know he flew a lot of missions. If you didn't know, during the war, the pilots in the 332nd actually had to fly double the number of combat missions as the white pilots did. So for the most part, a lot of them flew a lot more missions than most pilots during the war, and Fred Brewer was not an exception. So he flew bomber escort missions, he flew recon missions, strafing missions, general fighter pilot type missions during World War II.
Why did they fly double missions?
That was the rule of a segregated military at the time. If you talk to a lot of Tuskegee Airmen, which because of my work, I've been very fortunate to talk to a lot of them. Double missions, but also the purpose was double victory, right? They wanted to prove that African American pilots could be just as good as their white counterparts. They could be just as good, if not better. You know, you want the victory in the war. The double victory is victory at home against racism and victory in war against the enemy.
Yeah. Now, your job is to do the research, as you described to Les. Unfortunately, Fred lost his life in combat. What are the details of the events of Fred Brewer's death on October 1944?
So on October 29, 1944, Lieutenant Brewer was a pilot on a bomber escort mission to Regensburg, Germany. So their jobs were to protect the bombers from German fighters during the bombing mission. And the Tuskegee Airmen had an excellent record at protecting the bombers that they protected. During the mission, he lost altitude and crashed into a mountain. When someone goes missing during the war, when they first return to their base, any plane that didn't come back, the intelligence officer of the squadron would debrief all of the other pilots that were on the mission with them and ask them what happened. And so we have what's called a missing aircrew report, and it explains the details of what happened that day. All they really said was that he went missing, dipped down under the clouds near Delach, Germany. Now, they say Germany, but Germany and Austria. It's Delach, Austria, right over the border from Italy, and no one had ever seen him again. Not a lot of information there other than that they lost track of him.
Very vague. And now you're looking at an area on the ground that is vast. I mean, so there was no GPS. Everything back then was fly by compass, time and distance, and geographic location on the ground.
Now, Josh, you know it's always tough when we lose a service member, even if it was years ago. Can you give us some feedback on how his family reacted?
It's a really, really sad thing. He went missing. His mother got the telegram that he went missing, and she died very shortly after. If you asked her family, the whole family will say she died of a broken heart because her son wasn't coming home.
Yeah.
Wow. So Brenda's grandmother never put a Christmas tree up again.
Oh my gosh. So when did you start working on the Fred Brewer case as a research analyst?
I started working in DPAA in 2011 as a civilian, and pretty much immediately got put on the task of searching for aircraft that were lost in Italy during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
I went through every record of every plane that went down in Italy.
How many were in that database?
Around 690, 695. At the time, I didn't see Fred Brewer's crash site yet because he had been reported as being missing in Austria.
Right.
But what I did see right away, I found this Italian, I found an old web form of a bunch of old Italian guys that go out on the weekends and look for war-related stuff, mostly airplanes. And someone had posted about a P-51 that crashed in this place called Moggio Udinese.
Okay.
And the reason they posted it is because the farmer who owned the property on the side of the mountain had found some very large chunks of this P-51 Mustang and he had fashioned them into a crucifix. He had made a piece of artwork and put it at the spot of the crash as a memorial to the pilot who died there. And they were trying to figure out who the pilot was. So then I had a German record from Italy that said that a single engine plane crashed near Mojo on October 29th, 1944. So then I knew, okay, these two things are probably related. This crucifix that was made out of this part of this P-51 and this German report, they must be talking about the same thing. This must be the right place. So I was able to put that together. And then we started to go through the records of all of the unknowns that were recovered during the war. We have documents about those. They tell us where the remains were originally recovered from. They'll have dental charts, skeletal charts, height, weight estimates, those kinds of things that our laboratory can use. So we also made a database out of those. So then I started to look at, well, how many planes actually went missing altogether on October 29th, 1944? And luckily, it was really only a handful in the entire European theater of operations that day. And most of them were in northwestern Europe, way far away from where this plane had clearly crashed. And so I had it down to two possibilities. One was another Tuskegee Airman, Alphonso Davis, and then Lieutenant Fred Brewer.
Okay.
The records told me that the local priest and the local sanitation officer in Mojo Udinese told us that the plane crashed at 11 o'clock in the morning. I knew that Fred Brewer's plane had taken off at 10 o'clock in the morning. I knew that Alphonso Davis's mission didn't go out until 1300 that day. So this plane had already crashed before Alphonso Davis's plane had even taken off. So it really left the only possibility. If a single engine plane crashed in this place on October 29th, 1944, it really could not be historically anybody else's plane but Fred Brewer.
Josh, absolutely. That's all very interesting. And we're going to talk more about the lab and the DNA part in part 2. So let's fast forward past that for a minute. The DNA proved that these remains were indeed Fred Brewer's, and his remains were eventually brought home because of that. How did that feel?
Overwhelming. When we get an identification, it's like winning the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Because you feel every emotion. There's a sense of absolute pride in the work you've done, of course. Just the humility of bringing someone home who was part of the greatest generation. And then just the relief for the families. It takes the pressure off. We do interviews like this, like being on this podcast, and whenever DPAA is in the news, we're in the news a lot because of the home runs that we hit. And Lieutenant Brewer's case was a home run. What people don't see and don't talk about are the strikeouts. We strike out way more than we hit home runs, and the same amount of work goes into them.
Yeah.
And when we do strike out, it's a punch to the gut. And so when we make identifications and you're sitting in the funeral like that, it has to feel good enough to sustain you through how bad you feel about all the strikeouts. And the fact that it does tells you how good it has to be, what a good thing you've done, because to go through all the anxiety and pressure that comes with not finding all the other men you're trying to find, it has to feel good enough to pull you out of that rut, and it does.
Josh, I've never been part of this, but the way you just described it was so clear and accurate of the emotional highs and lows that I've never heard that kind of adequate description of an occupation and achievement and failure as you just gave right there. That was amazing.
So Josh, this purpose of recovering loved ones, this has to be the reason why you wanted to work in the DPAA in the first place, right?
I took JROTC in high school too.
Okay. Junior ROTC. Okay.
So I was junior ROTC in high school. And even from high school, from back then, and then going through basic training, the mantra, especially in the U.S. Army, that we don't leave anybody behind, gets so ingrained in you. And then I have a chance to be the living embodiment of that. Even 40, 50, 60, 80 years later, we will still go looking for you if you're missing. Just the idea of that, I was drawn to it.
We really appreciate you joining us here on Army Matters, brother.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Josh, thanks for your service, and thanks for helping bring people home.
Thank you too, Sergeant Major.
In part 2, we'll talk with Dr. Veronica Keyes and Dr. Don Berry, two members of the team at DPAA, who will detail what they did to discover and identify the remains of Father Kapaun. And then we'll talk to Ray again about the importance of bringing a family member home. In previous episodes, our co-host General Les Smith has talked about playing golf and how much he enjoys it. In today's chapter spotlight, our Central Virginia chapter has the perfect event for him. On June 10th of this year, the chapter will be celebrating the 249th birthday of the United States Army with its annual Birthday Golf Tournament. Held at the incredible Hunting Hawk Golf Club in Glen Allen, Virginia, the tournament will not only be a day of fun and camaraderie, but will raise funds for the chapter scholarship program, Virginia War Memorial events, and awards for ROTC and JROTC, among other programs. If you're in the area, grab your clubs and join them. And if he's not too busy recording another podcast, maybe Les can join them too. Congrats to Leif Johnson, the chapter's golf committee, and everyone involved.
4. To all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Army Matters is brought to you by the Association of the United States Army, the U.S. Army's professional association, member-supported, Army-connected. Visit us at ausa.org for more information or to become a member. Your membership helps AUSA continue to carry out its mission, educate, inform, and connect with the total Army, our industry partners, and supporters of a strong national defense. Today's episode was hosted by Lieutenant General Retired Les Smith and SMA Retired Dan Daly, and anchor hosted by Carrie Barrow-Heckes. Anthony Del Call is the producer and writer, and Andy Bosnack is the supervising sound editor. Ellen Toner is the content editor. Unzinga Curry is the executive producer, and the senior producers are Carrie Barrow-Heckes and LaSharon Duncan. Be sure to subscribe to Army Matters wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review. As you know, we love seeing stars in the Army, especially if it comes in the form of a 5-star review. AUSA's Army Matters podcast can also be heard on Reach Across America Radio on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, on the iHeartRadio app, the Odyssey app, and the TuneIn app with the search of the word REEF. AUSA's Army Matters podcast primary purpose is to entertain. The podcast does not constitute advice or services. While guests are invited to listen, listeners, please note that you're not being provided professional advice from the podcast or the guest. The views and opinions of our guests do not necessarily reflect the views of AUSA. For questions or to provide topic recommendations, email us at podcast@ausa.org. I'm LaSharon Duncan. Hope you have a great Army Day. Hooah!